President-elect Trump's pick to chair the Federal Communications Commission is warning Disney that he will be monitoring ABC's affiliate negotiations closely to ensure that they can serve local communities. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr sent that notice in a letter to Disney CEO Bob Iger on Saturday. It comes as ABC is in the midst of renegotiating with local stations that carry its programming. Carr expressed concern in his letter over reporting that suggested that some local affiliate agreements were set to expire at the end of the year without a new deal. The letter comes just days after ABC News announced that they settled a defamation suit brought by President-elect Trump for $15 million. Trump has also suggested that ABC should be punished for what he has claimed was a biased performance by debate moderators in a September debate with Vice President Harris. Disney has not responded to our request for comment. The House Ethics Committee released its long-awaited report into former Congressman Matt Gaetz on Monday. After a roughly 3.5-year investigation, the panel found substantial evidence that Gaetz violated House rules as well as state and federal laws. The allegations against the former congressman included prostitution, statutory rape, and illicit drug use. Washington, D.C. correspondent Raquel Martin takes a closer look at the report and the fallout for Matt Gaetz.
Both Democrats and 2 House Republicans on that committee voted to make this report public. That despite pushback from some Trump allies, including Speaker of the House Mike Johnson. Just days before Christmas and while Congress is out, the House Ethics Committee drops a bombshell. A new 42-page report accuses former Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz of paying tens of thousands of dollars to women, likely for sex and drugs, including to a 17-year-old girl. The findings are based on nearly 3 years of evidence, including text messages, financial records, and travel receipts. The bipartisan House panel interviewed more than a dozen witnesses. In the report, they write Gaetz, quote, violated House rules and other standards of conduct, prohibiting prostitution, statutory rape, and illicit drug use. Gaetz calls the release of the report a smear. He and his allies on Capitol Hill argue because he is no longer in Congress, the panel did not have the jurisdiction to publish the investigation.
I think that's extremely hypocritical.
Just a month ago, Gaetz was selected as the president-elect's top choice to lead the Department of Justice. The report underscores Senate Republicans' pushback. In the end, Gaetz withdrew his nomination, he and Trump agreeing the Senate confirmation process had become a distraction.
I wanted quite badly to be your next Attorney General, and to be nominated by President Trump for that position was indeed the honor of my professional life.
Now, it's unclear exactly what the future holds for Gaetz. He recently announced he's accepted an anchor role at a broadcast network. For now in Washington, Raquel Martin, back to you.
Thank you to Raquel Martin for that report. President-elect Donald Trump is sparking a new feud with Panama over the vital maritime canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans.
Has anyone ever heard of the Panama Canal? Huh? Because we're being ripped off at the Panama Canal like we're being ripped off everywhere else. You got to treat us fairly, and they haven't treated us fairly. If the principles, both moral and legal, of this magnanimous gesture of giving are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question.
Trump has taken issue with what he says is exorbitant prices paid by the U.S. for using the passageway. The canal has been under Panamanian control for nearly 25 years, under a deal pushed by then-President Carter in 1977. Panama's president, Jose Raul Molino, pushed back on Trump's claims in a statement saying that the sovereignty and independence of our country are not negotiable. And in a Truth Social post over the weekend, Trump also called on the U.S. owning Greenland as an absolute necessity. Now, this isn't the president-elect's first time calling for the U.S. to purchase Greenland, which is owned by Denmark. Back in 2019, Trump said that buying Greenland was strategically interesting, which triggered an angry response from the Danish Prime Minister, who called the idea absurd. And on Monday, Greenland's Prime Minister responded to Trump's latest comment in a statement saying, quote, "We are not for sale and will never be for sale." The Biden administration is withdrawing a proposed rule that would have expanded access to birth control pills and made it more difficult for insurers to exclude coverage of the medication. The withdrawal will leave in place a Trump-era rule allowing employers to cite non-religious moral objections to the Affordable Care Act's requirement to cover contraception. The Department of Health and Human Services says the rule was withdrawn in order to focus their time and resources on matters other than finalizing the rule. American Airlines has resumed service across the country today after a technical issue early Tuesday grounded all of the airline's planes. According to the airline, that technical issue affected the systems needed to release flights. In a Tuesday morning post on X, the airline issued a statement saying that it was working to resolve the issue and apologized for any inconvenience. The ground stop lasted exactly 1 hour, but passengers say it already impacted their holiday travel plans.
My heart sank, and I just was imagining us missing our connection. That's adding a lot of stress. We're going to Bangkok, so any little ripple, and we have very little time between flights.
Flights remain grounded due to weather at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, the main hub for American. That ground stop was lifted at 10 o'clock Eastern this morning. LaGuardia also lifted a weather-related ground stop, also just after 10 o'clock Eastern. Good news for taxpayers. If you never received your pandemic stimulus payments and forgot to claim it on your tax returns, the IRS is sending them out over the next year. The IRS announced this month that eligible people who did not claim the recovery rebate credit on their 2021 tax returns will automatically receive payments starting this month. That credit was for those who did not receive their stimulus checks during the COVID-19 pandemic. The IRS says that most eligible taxpayers already claimed the credit, but for those who didn't, the maximum amount they will receive will be $1,400 per individual. You can check if you're eligible online at irs.gov. Retail clothing giant Nordstrom is set to go private. Nordstrom family members in a Mexican retail group struck a $6.25 billion deal to acquire the century-old department store. Taking the company private might give it more room to reinvigorate sales and revive the chain. The new owners can focus on the future and won't have to deal with short-term scrutiny from public markets, Global Data Managing Director Neil Saunders said. Nordstrom announced last year that it was closing all of its Canadian stores and cutting 2,500 jobs as a result. Sales have not been great for the company for the past decade, essentially flatlining. But now shareholders will get around $24 in cash for each share that they own. Competition from giants like Walmart, Target, and Amazon have led to traditional department stores suffering. In just under 1 month, Republicans will have full control of both Congress and the White House after sweeping through the 2024 elections. The Hill's Mychael Schnell and Julia Manchester are here to take a look back at how the party was able to clinch Washington.
All right. 2024, we knew it was going to be huge because of the election.
Yeah.
I feel like it probably exceeded all of our expectations because of all the twists and turns.
Yeah.
But I guess, Julia, let's start with, of course, the crown jewel of 2024, the election. It was an interesting primary season, then a weird twist over the summer, and then the final results.
It was so wild, and I think there were so many twists and turns that we didn't expect. Just going back to the primary season and the caucus season even, being in Iowa, I don't think I've ever experienced temperatures that cold. Remember, the caucuses took place amid this giant blizzard.
Right.
So we saw the candidates, Trump, DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Vivek Ramaswamy when he was running for president, crisscrossing the Hawkeye state in a bid to appeal to a lot of these caucus goers. We started to see the race solidify, though, once we saw, after that, the Iowa caucuses, Donald Trump obviously won, DeSantis distant second, Nikki Haley third place, Vivek Ramaswamy dropped out of the race after, endorsed Donald Trump, and then shortly before the New Hampshire primary, Ron DeSantis announced that he was stepping out of the race and endorsed Trump, even though there was definitely still some tension between the two of them there. But what was interesting about the Republican primary is that Nikki Haley continued to run against Trump well into, after Super Tuesday, and she continued to get a significant amount of votes, not the majority of Republican primary votes,
but a good chunk.
But a good chunk. In some states up to 20%.
Right.
So I think there was the question as to whether Trump was vulnerable with some of these voters. So we saw that take place. On the Democratic side, there obviously wasn't as much of a competitive primary. It was interesting. I was in New Hampshire, and Joe Biden had called on and endorsed the plan for South Carolina to be the first in the nation primary over New Hampshire. So he actually wasn't running in New Hampshire, but we saw Congressman Dean Phillips run in New Hampshire. And I think, even though it was not a competitive primary, Phillips ended up dropping out pretty soon after. We did see an intro, I think, to how AI or artificial intelligence could impact this election. Dean Phillips actually picked up, excuse me, you saw, a number of, in New Hampshire, a number of voters targeted by a robocall that was in Biden's voice. And it wasn't actually Joe Biden. So that was a big takeaway from that primary. So we saw that, obviously, it ended up Biden, predictably winning the Democratic primary, Trump winning the Republican primary, but things got even more hairy when we
It was that debate.
It was that debate.
It was that June debate.
Yeah, and I think it was also before the debate. I mean, there were a lot of rumblings about President Biden's health and fitness for office, and I know that a lot of lawmakers were talking about that.
So what happened was we had that, I remember it perfectly, we had that evening, that June debate, and it's when President Biden clearly came out and had a rocky start, right? He was clearly struggling in the beginning of that, and then there was a lot of commentary at that moment being like, well, should Biden step aside? Is he going to be able to make it all the way to the general election? Would he be able to serve another 4 years in office? And I had been peppering lawmakers with this question all along, and they said, we expect that he'll eventually step aside, but we hadn't heard anyone publicly call on him to step aside, at least in the House Democratic Caucus. And then came a veteran of the House named Lloyd Doggett. He was the first House Democrat to call on President Biden to step aside from the ticket. He spoke about it because of his experience on Capitol Hill. He decided that he needed to make this statement.
This was after the debate.
This was after the debate. And then after that, we saw just this constant trickle of more lawmakers joining that fray, joining that chorus of voices saying he could step aside. And then finally, I remember it was on a Sunday when it came to that letter that President Biden put out saying he was dropping out. And then a few moments later, he would give he was endorsing Kamala Harris for the nomination.
You know what was so interesting, though, about the trickling in of people calling for Biden to step down? You saw a lot of people from Obama world or Obama campaign alums like David Axelrod, for example, really pushing this narrative. But there was also a lot of rumblings about former Speaker Nancy Pelosi's role in this.
Right, and my colleague and I, Mike Lillis, had reported that she was working behind the scenes trying to encourage Biden to step aside. She was sort of being somebody who a lot of folks were going to consult with and to talk to about this issue. She's no longer in leadership, of course, but she's still just such a towering figure within the Democratic Party. We'll remember, I think, when we're going through the history books about what went down, was Nancy Pelosi did that Morning Joe interview where she said, should Biden stay in the race? After Biden had made it very clear in every single way he could that he was remaining in this race, and Nancy Pelosi said, well, that's a decision for him to make. And that was, again, one of these sort of moments where the tide seemed to have turned. And I heard from a lot of lawmakers that they felt like those comments from Pelosi were sort of a green light to them to voice their concerns with Biden at the top.
So we'll get to the Harris candidacy shortly, but sort of in the middle of all of this, you had these questions of whether Biden would step down, and then the first assassination attempt against Donald Trump.
That's right.
I mean, it was shocking because we hadn't seen anything like this since Reagan, that assassination attempt against Reagan just down the street here in Washington in the 1980s. But it was caught on camera, real time. I mean, you can literally see the bullet whizzing by his ear, clipped his ear, and then the imagery of him standing up, the Secret Service members surrounding him, holding up his fist, the blood streaming down his face.
It was powerful.
What an image.
Yeah, it was a striking image, and that, of course, had a number of reverberations across the country, especially on Capitol Hill, where we saw a bipartisan group of lawmakers actually look into that assassination attempt and what went wrong with the security failures. But it's also worth noting, just a few days after that assassination attempt was the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. I was there. And there were a lot of folks, when I walked into the convention area, it was sort of more of a somber mood, right? A lot of the time these conventions are very loud, very boisterous. There was just more of a solemn feeling because it was just a few days after, again, by a few inches, maybe even a fraction of an inch, then former President Trump's life was saved. And so a lot of folks were wondering what kind of Trump will we see when he comes out. And he came out on the first 3 nights of that convention wearing a bandage on his ear, which I will note, in the days after we actually saw convention goers on the floor wearing a bandage on their ear in solidarity. And then the former president came out onto the convention stage, and for about the first 20 or 30 minutes or so of his speech, it was going through what actually happened on that stage in a very somber way, Trump recognizing the luck he has to have his life. Afterwards, it went into some of his greatest hits, some things that we've heard in the past, some of his campaign promises, and some of his gripes he has with some former enemies, what have you. But you could definitely notice that there was a change in the tenor and the mood of the convention because it came just days after that extremely tragic event.
Right, and I want to exchange notes on the RNC versus the DNC.
Yeah.
I was at the DNC, and also, you had the assassination attempt ahead of the RNC, but you had Kamala Harris, the vice president, stepping in to be the Democratic nominee shortly before the DNC. I know there were so many questions about whether there would be a brokered or contested convention should Biden step down, but I remember, I believe it was on a Sunday, that he announced he was stepping down, that Harris would replace him. Just opening my inbox, and we were all working that day trying to collect all the statements and such. It was Democrat after Democrat, whether it was a House member, a senator, a governor, all lining up behind Harris.
That's
really,
right.
I think there was a lot of skepticism as to whether she could get them together, that coalition, but she did. And the DNC felt certainly like a party in many ways. I mean, you had that roll call vote with each of the states, and having their own, each chair chose their own, song or whatever. You had the Obama speaking, Michelle Obama. I think, obviously, one of the
very
powerful. I think one of the biggest applause lines of the entire week at the DNC. Oprah Winfrey, for example, you'd Kerry Washington.
It was a who's who of Democratic
Yeah,
figures.
exactly, and a big. I mean, it sort of foreshadowed, I think, the celebrity presence we'd see on the campaign trail, which I think Democrats were enthusiastic about to begin with. Didn't seem to have much of an impact, but certainly historic. And there was that image that I think the New York Times photographer captured of Kamala Harris's niece, the vice president's niece, watching her deliver her DNC acceptance speech. And she had the two pigtails, and it sort of mirrored what Kamala Harris looked like when she was a little girl. Obviously a powerful image for little girls, particularly young girls, young women of color, watching that very historic moment. But then we got into the nitty-gritty of the campaign, and only, less than 100 days after. Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Right, so I guess, I would say to wrap up the story of the 2024 election, but perhaps it's just, the end of the first chapter, because now we have to see what the Trump administration looks like. We had those final 100 days where we did have a debate between the two candidates, and then there was the debate about having potentially another debate. We saw both candidates fan out onto different podcasts and have different interviews and whatnot. And then came election night. And we had been hearing, I know us two had been hearing for a while from forecasters saying they expected that the results of the election could take a little while to announce because it was just going to be so close. Every forecaster, every pollster said this race is going to come down to a photo finish. But by around 2 a.m. on the Wednesday after Election Day, we had a winner, and it was clear that Donald Trump made a comeback to the White House.
Yeah, absolutely, and it was interesting in the lead up to 2 a.m. to that call, and big major hat tip to our partners at Decision Desk for calling that first. We were seeing Harris underperforming in a number of states, the battleground states, but also in traditionally blue strongholds like New York, like California, like Northern Virginia. And I remember one of our editors coming up to me in the newsroom saying, she's not doing so great in Northern Virginia. Not losing, but she's certainly underperforming.
Not hitting her marks.
Exactly. And I think that's the big story of the election results. I mean, ultimately, we saw the results from a number of these battleground states. It was close, within 2 to 3 points of each other. But I think the big story is how much ground Trump was able to make up, convert in California, New York, even in Florida. Florida was already trending red.
Spoken from the Florida woman herself.
Exactly. But he was winning blue counties like Osceola County, for example, a county that Joe Biden won by double digits. It's outside of Orlando. It's Central Florida County. Joe Biden won it by double digits in 2020. Trump flipped it by, I believe, 1 to 3 points, very narrowly.
Sure.
But he flipped it. And it's also a large Hispanic population, a large Puerto Rican population. I remember in the run-up to Election Day, there were a lot of questions as to, whether Donald Trump and this rally he had at Madison
That's
Square
another
Garden.
moment we have to touch on.
Exactly, yes. When a comedian made, a number of very controversial racist remarks about Puerto Ricans, how that would impact Trump. It didn't.
Right.
It didn't. And it seems like there was this movement, among Republicans, independent voters, that they were embracing Trump's economic populist message.
It seemed, James Carville is obviously a noted Democratic strategist, and one of his most famous lines, if not his most famous line, is "It's the economy, stupid."
Yeah,
and it seems like that once again rang true. I had spoken to a lot of Democrats in the lead up to Election Day who said the biggest issue that voters are voting on, at least for Democrats, is women's reproductive rights and abortion.
Yeah.
Remember, this was the first, general election since the fall of Roe v. Wade in the summer of 2022. So a lot of Democrats were banking on it. Well, they had better than expected returns in the midterms in 2022. They were hoping that that energy and that enthusiasm and, quite frankly, anger about the Supreme Court decision and then other state level changes that had been made, they were hoping that that would motivate voters to the ballot box and have them vote Democratic. Not to mention the fact that there were a number of ballot referenda pertaining to women's reproductive rights that were on ballots across the country. Democrats, I think, were banking on that to help support them at the polls at the end of the day. And it turns out that the economy was just more important for folks than women's reproductive rights, and more people chose Trump's message on the economy than Harris's.
It was huge. It was huge. And I know we talk so much about the election. The election was a major story of the year. But Congress, and particularly Republicans in Congress, had a big year. I know you were right in the action up there.
Yeah, there were a few things to touch on because, of course, Republicans were still grappling, particularly in the House, with this ultra-thin majority, right? It was just a few seats, a few votes that they can lose on any given moment. They were still dealing with a Democratic Senate and a Democrat in the White House, and there was a ton of news on Capitol Hill. Probably the top thing was that Congress was actually able to approve foreign aid, which includes funding for Ukraine. That had been a big fight on Capitol Hill among Republicans for really months. It had to do with former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. It's something that Speaker Johnson had to grapple with right out the gate. And at the end of the day, Republicans led by Johnson got this over the finish line, and it was a massive feat. Now, was it perfect for him? No, because it led to a motion to vacate against him, led by Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, which Johnson was ultimately able to defeat, which put him on stronger ground than going into the summer and now into the fall. So next year, House Republicans are going to have an even slimmer majority, if that's even possible. At one point, it's going to be 217 to 215, so they are going to have no votes to spare on any party line vote. But if 2024 was newsy, I think we can assume that 2025 is probably going to give it a run for its money.
Yeah, well, we're going to have these blockbuster, what I assume could be blockbuster hearings in the Senate for a number of Trump
right out the gate.
Right out the gate. We have off-year elections in Virginia and New Jersey. Obviously, your yearly government funding battles, that kind of stuff.
Debt limit is likely going to come up this year.
Exactly. So a lot to catch up with.
And something I assume you're going to be keeping an eye on. Who's the next standard bearer for the Democratic Party?
Who is the next? We have that DNC chair race coming up in February, but we already see Gavin Newsom, a number of other Democratic governors kind of jockeying for that position going into 2028, but we're only in 2025, already talking about 2028.
2024 was a banner year, but again, I think 2025 is going to give it a run for its money.
No sleep for the, what is it? No sleep for the weary.
For the weary.
For the weary, yeah. No, we're pretty weary right now. It's been a long year.
We'll be covering it all, though.
Yes, but it's great to have the support of our viewers and our readers, and we're excited to jump back into it in the new year.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you, Julia and Michael. Happy holidays, everyone. That is today's Daily Debrief. I'm Zach Schonfeld. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for more on the intersection between politics and policy.